The first time Soren saw the sea, he was certain it would kill him. He had spent his entire 23 years in the gentle valleys of the southern kingdom, where the loudest water was the murmur of a brook, and the highest wave was the ripple from a skipping stone. The sea was a myth to him, a blue impossibility that existed only in the tales of drunk sailors and old poems. But now, standing on the deck of the Serpent's Wrath with iron cuffs biting into his swollen wrists and the salt wind whipping his dark hair across his face, he understood that myths were real, and they were merciless. The Longship rose and fell on the gray swells like a living thing, each movement sending a fresh wave of nausea through his already hollow body. He had not eaten in 3 days, not since the raiders had burned his loads whole and slaughtered everyone inside. He had been spared only because Jarl Hakon, the old Viking chieftain, had seen him reading a Latin manuscript by the light of the flames and decided that a literate slave was worth more than a dead scholar. But as Soren leaned over the railing and emptied the last of his stomach into the churning foam, he wondered if death might have been kinder. "Pathetic," a voice said behind him. Soren turned slowly, wiping his mouth with the back of his trembling hand, and found himself facing a man who looked as though he had been carved from the same gray stone as the northern cliffs. He was tall, well over 6 feet, with shoulders that strained the seams of his leather tunic and arms covered in runic tattoos that seemed to shift in the pale morning light. His hair was dark and pulled back from his sharp face, revealing a thin white scar that ran from his temple to his cheekbone. But it was his eyes that held Soren frozen, gray as a winter storm, cold as the deep sea, and utterly without warmth. He wore the bearing of someone accustomed to command, and when he crossed his arms over his broad chest, the muscles in his forearms shifted like cables beneath his skin. "You cannot even stand without holding on to something," the man continued, his voice flat, uninterested, as if Soren were a particularly disappointing piece of cargo. "You have been on this ship for less than a day, and you have already vomited 3 times. You will be dead in a week, less if we hit rough weather." Soren's stomach lurched again, but he forced himself to straighten his spine. He had lost everything, his home, his family, his freedom, but he had not lost his pride. Not yet. Not ever, if he could help it. "Then you should have killed me on land," he said, and his voice came out steadier than he felt, sharpened by a defiance that had survived every beating and every loss. It would have been less trouble for everyone, less vomit to clean, less food to waste, less space in your precious ship. The man's gray eyes narrowed. He stepped closer, close enough that Soren could smell the leather and pine and old iron that clung to him, close enough that Soren could see the individual lines of the tattoos winding up his neck. "I am Torben," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "First mate of the Serpent's Wrath. My father, Jarl Hakon, is the man who decided to keep you alive. I thought it was a mistake then, and I think it is a mistake now. But I follow orders, even when they are foolish." He reached out and gripped Soren's chin, tilting his face up to the weak sunlight. His fingers were rough, calloused, impossibly strong. "You will stay in my quarters. You will eat what I give you. You will not speak to the crew unless spoken to. And you will not die, because if you die, my father will consider it my failure. Do you understand, Southerner?" Soren stared into those cold gray eyes, and something in him, some stubborn, foolish, unkillable thing that had refused to die even when his world was burning around him, whispered that he should not look away. He had spent his whole life looking away, bowing his head, making himself small, but he had nothing left to lose now, nothing except his dignity. "I understand," he said, and his voice was quiet but steady. "But you should know something, Torben of the Serpent's Wrath. I have survived worse than you, worse than this ship, worse than this sea. I have survived fire and famine and the death of everyone I ever loved. And I did not survive all of that just to drown in a puddle of my own vomit on a Viking longship." Torben's grip tightened for a moment, his gray eyes searching Soren's face as if looking for the lie. Then, slowly, he released Soren's chin and stepped back. Something flickered in those cold eyes, surprise, perhaps, or the first tiny spark of respect. "We shall see, Southerner," he said. "We shall see if your words are as strong as your will." He turned and walked away without another word, his boots thudding against the wooden deck, and Soren clung to the railing and tried not to be sick again. That was the first day of the voyage that would change them both. The second day was worse than the first. The sea had not calmed. If anything, the swells had grown larger, and the wind had picked up, whipping the waves into whitecaps that crashed against the hull with a sound like thunder. Soren lay on a thin pallet in Torben's cramped quarters at the stern of the ship, curled into a tight ball, shivering despite the furs that had been thrown over him. The smell of the bilge water, the creaking of the timbers, the constant rising and falling, all of it conspired to keep him in a state of half-conscious misery. He had not eaten the bread Torben had left for him. He had not drunk the water. He had simply existed, curled in on himself like a wounded animal, waiting for the end. The door to the quarters opened, and Torben ducked inside. The space was so small that even the first mate had to stoop to avoid hitting his head on the low ceiling, and the ceiling was so low that Soren could touch it from where he lay. Torben carried a bowl of something that steamed in the cold air, and his expression was as unreadable as ever, but there was something in the way he moved, something careful and almost hesitant, that Soren had not expected. "You need to eat," Torben said, setting the bowl beside the pallet with a heavy thunk. "If you do not eat, you will not have the strength to recover. And if you do not recover, you will die, slowly, painfully, and in my quarters, which will smell very bad." "Your concern is touching," Soren mumbled into the furs, his voice muffled and weak. "I'm not concerned. I am practical." Torben knelt beside him, actually knelt, the mighty first mate of the Serpent's Wrath, on his knees in the cramped, stinking space, and lifted Soren's head with one hand. With the other, he brought a spoonful of broth to Soren's cracked lips. "Eat," he said. It was not a request. It was a command, delivered in the same tone he probably used to order his sailors into battle. But there was something beneath the command, something that sounded almost like fear. Soren opened his mouth and swallowed. The broth was warm and salty and rich with the taste of fish and wild herbs, and it settled in his empty stomach like a blessing after a long drought. He took another spoonful, then another, until the bowl was empty and his eyelids were heavy and his body felt less like a cage and more like a shelter. Torben did not leave immediately. He sat beside the pallet, his back against the wooden wall, his long legs stretched out in front of him, and he watched Soren with those cold gray eyes. But they were not as cold now. They were thoughtful, almost soft, as if he was seeing something he had not expected to find. "I lost a man on my first voyage as first mate," Torben said quietly, breaking the silence that had settled between them like a blanket. "His name was Anders. He was not a warrior. He was a carpenter brought along to repair the ship. He was good with his hands, quiet, kept to himself. I did not think much of him at first." He paused, his jaw tightening, the scar on his cheek pulling taut. "He fell ill on the second week, seasickness at first, then fever, then something worse. Something that turned his skin yellow and made him cough blood. I did not know how to help him. None of us did. We had no healer on board, no medicines, nothing but prayer and hope." Soren listened, barely breathing. Torben's voice was rough, like stones grinding together, but there was a vulnerability beneath it that Soren had never expected to hear from a Viking warrior. "He died on the 15th day, Torben continued. "I held his hand while he faded. He asked for his mother, and I could not give her to him. He asked for water, and I gave him water. He asked me not to let him die alone, and I did not. But he died anyway. He died, and I could do nothing to stop it." He looked down at his scarred hands, at the tattoos that covered his knuckles, at the hands that had killed and killed and killed. "I have carried that with me for 7 years. The weight of him, the weight of my failure." Soren turned his head on the thin pillow to look at Torben. The first mate's face was still hard, still unreadable, but his hands, those scarred, powerful, terrible hands, were trembling slightly. "You are not Anders," Torben said, meeting Soren's eyes. "You are not a carpenter. You are not even a warrior. You are a southerner, a prisoner, a slave in all but name. But you are a person, and you are in my care, and I will not let you die the way he died. Not on my ship, not on my watch." He stood abruptly, as if embarrassed by his own words, as if the vulnerability had burned him. He moved toward the door, his broad shoulders blocking the light. Sleep, Southerner. Tomorrow you will come up on deck, you will learn to stand, you will learn to work, and you will survive. Those are my orders." He left before Soren could respond, the door closing behind him with a soft thud. Soren lay in the darkness, listening to the creak of the timbers and the crash of the waves, and the distant sound of the crew singing something in their harsh northern tongue. And for the first time since his capture, for the first time since he had watched his world burn to ash, he did not feel entirely alone. By the 5th day, Soren had learned to keep his food down. By the 8th day, he could walk across the deck without holding onto the railing, though his bad leg, an old injury from childhood that had never healed properly, still ached with every step. By the 12th day, he had memorized the names of every crew member, learned the rhythm of their shifts and the hierarchy of their ranks, and begun to understand the language of the ship, the way the wind spoke through the ropes, the way the waves told stories of storms to come, the way the creaking of the hull could warn of danger long before it appeared. Torben watched him from a distance, saying little, but Soren could feel those gray eyes on him constantly, assessing, measuring, waiting for him to fail. But Soren did not fail. He worked alongside the other sailors, bailing water from the hold, mending ropes, even helping the cook prepare meals. He kept his head down and his mouth shut, and he learned. He learned that the youngest sailor, Leif, was only 16 and terrified of the sea. He learned that the old helmsman Gunnar had lost 2 sons to a storm 10 years ago and had never recovered. He learned that Torben was not the cold, unfeeling brute he appeared to be, that he checked on the crew in the middle of the night, that he gave extra rations to the sick, that he carried the weight of every man on board as if it were his own. On the 15th day, a storm came. It was not the great storm, not yet, but it was enough to test the ship and everyone on it. Rain lashed the deck in sheets so thick that Soren could barely see his own hand in front of his face. The waves rose like gray mountains, crashing over the bow and sending icy water cascading across the deck. The crew worked in grim silence, their faces pale with effort and fear, pulling ropes and adjusting sails and praying to gods that Soren did not believe in. Soren had been assigned to help bail water from the hold, a miserable back-breaking task that left him soaked to the bone and shivering uncontrollably. But he did not complain. He worked. He learned. And when a massive wave broke over the side and swept young Leif toward the railing, toward the cold, dark, hungry sea, Soren was the one who grabbed his arm and hauled him back to safety. The boy was shaking, crying, clinging to Soren like a lifeline. "I've got you," Soren said, his voice steady despite his own fear. "I've got you. You're not going anywhere." Torben saw it. He was at the helm, fighting to keep the ship steady, but he saw. He did not say anything. He could not with the wind screaming and the waves crashing, but he nodded, a small, almost imperceptible movement of his head, and Soren felt something warm bloom in his chest despite the cold, despite the fear, despite the water soaking through his clothes. That night, after the storm had passed and the crew had collapsed into exhausted sleep, Torben found Soren sitting alone at the bow of the ship, staring at the stars. The sky was clear now, a vast expanse of black velvet scattered with diamonds, and the sea was calm, almost peaceful, as if the storm had never happened. Soren had wrapped himself in a thin blanket and was leaning against the railing, his bad leg stretched out in front of him, his breath misting in the cold air. "You should be resting," Torben said, settling onto the deck beside him. His voice was quiet, almost gentle, and there was no mockery in it. "So should you," Soren replied without looking away from the stars. "You are the first mate. You need your strength more than I do. If you collapse, the whole ship collapses." Torben was silent for a moment. Then he said, "You saved life today, Eric's boy. His mother asked me to keep him safe. She is a widow and he is all she has left. I just grabbed his arm," Soren said, shrugging. "Anyone would have done the same." "No," Torben said, and his voice was quiet but firm. "They would not have. Most of the crew still see you as a prisoner, a southerner, a burden. They mock you behind your back, and some of them, like Eric, would happily see you thrown overboard. But you grabbed Leif's arm anyway. You did not hesitate. You did not think about whether he would do the same for you." He turned to look at Soren, and in the starlight his grey eyes seemed almost silver, almost soft. Why? Soren considered the question. He thought of his own younger brother, dead in the burning hole, his small body pinned beneath a fallen beam. He thought of the way the boy had clung to him in the darkness, begging him not to leave, and the way Soren had been too weak, too slow, too late. He thought of all the things he could not save, all the hands he could not reach, all the voices he could not answer. Because no one should die alone, Soren said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. Because I have died alone, inside 1,000 times. I have watched everyone I loved die, and I have held their hands while they faded, and I know what it feels like to be the one left behind. And I would not wish that on anyone. Not even my enemies. Not even Eric. Tobin's hand moved. It was a small movement, barely a twitch, but his fingers brushed against Soren's where they rested on the deck between them. The touch lasted only a heartbeat, but Soren felt it like a brand, warm, electric, impossible to ignore. You are not my enemy, Tobin said, and his voice was rough, as if the words cost him something precious. I thought you were. When I first saw you, so weak, so useless, so soft, I thought you were a burden, something to be endured. But you are not weak. You are not useless. You are. He trailed off, shaking his head, his dark hair falling across his scarred face. I do not have the words. I am a sailor, not a poet. I have spent my whole life killing and sailing and following orders. I do not know how to say what I am feeling. Soren's heart was pounding so hard he was sure Tobin could hear it. He turned his hand over, palm up, an invitation. Then do not use words, he said softly. Tobin stared at their hands for a long moment. The scars on his fingers caught the starlight. The tattoos on his knuckles seemed to glow. Then, slowly, hesitantly, as if he were reaching for something fragile that might shatter at the wrong touch, he laced his fingers through Soren's. His hand was so large that it swallowed Soren's completely, so warm that Soren could feel the heat spreading up his arm and into his chest. They sat like that for a long time, watching the stars and the sea, saying nothing. The ship creaked gently beneath them, the waves lapped against the hull, and somewhere in the darkness a night bird sang. It was enough. The days that followed were a careful, silent dance. Tobin did not speak of what had happened at the bow, and neither did Soren, but something had shifted between them, something that could not be undone. Tobin began to seek Soren out, not obviously, not in a way that the crew would notice, but consistently. He ate his meals near where Soren worked. He found excuses to pass by Soren's corner of the deck. He started asking Soren's opinion on navigation, on the stars, on the best route to the new land. And Soren, who had spent his whole life reading and learning and memorizing maps that no one else cared about, found that his knowledge was suddenly valuable. You read the stars better than any of my crew, Tobin said one evening, standing beside Soren at the helm. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple and gold, and the wind was warm for the first time since they had left the southern coast. Where did you learn? From books, Soren said. I was a scholar. I read everything I could find, navigation, medicine, history, languages. I thought knowledge would keep me safe. I thought if I knew enough, no one could hurt me. He laughed, a soft, bitter sound. I was wrong. Tobin was quiet for a moment. Then he said, knowledge did not keep you safe, but it might keep this ship safe, and that is not nothing. On the 23rd day, Eric the Brute decided to act. He had hated Soren from the moment the Southerner had been brought aboard, hated his soft hands, his educated voice, the way Tobin looked at him with something other than contempt. He had been watching, waiting for an opportunity, and the thick fog that rolled in on the 23rd morning was his chance. Soren was at the railing, staring into the white nothingness, when Eric appeared beside him like a ghost out of the mist. You think you are one of us now, Eric said, his voice low and ugly, barely audible over the sound of the waves. You think because the first mate lets you warm his bed, you are safe. You think you are special. I do not warm anyone's bed, Soren said, keeping his voice calm though his heart was pounding. And even if I did, it would not be your concern. My relationship with Tobin, whatever it is none of your business. Eric's face twisted with rage. He grabbed Soren's arm, his left arm, the one attached to his bad side, and yanked him toward the railing. The wood was slick with mist and Soren's feet slipped. You are nothing, Eric hissed, his face inches from Soren's. A southerner, a slave, a thing. And things can be thrown overboard. Things can be lost in the fog, and no one will ever know. He lifted Soren as if he weighed nothing, and Soren felt his feet leave the deck. He felt the cold mist on his face, felt the vast emptiness of the sea waiting below, felt the terror rising in his throat like bile. He opened his mouth to scream, and then Eric was gone, torn away from him by a force that moved like a hurricane, like the fist of an angry god. Torben. The first mate had come out of the fog like a vengeful spirit, his face twisted with a fury that made the storm seem gentle. He had grabbed Eric by the collar and thrown him against the mast with enough force to crack the wood. The larger man crumpled to the deck, gasping, and Torben stood over him, his chest heaving, his hands clenched into fists, his gray eyes blazing. "Touch him again," Torben said, his voice low and deadly, each word a blade, "and I will throw you overboard myself. I will tie weights to your feet and watch you sink. I will listen to you scream until the water fills your lungs, and I will tell my father that you fell. Do you understand me, Eric?" Eric's face was white with fear, his mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. "Do you understand?" Torben repeated, each word a hammer blow. "Yes," Eric gasped. "Yes, first I understand, I understand." Torben stepped back, his chest still heaving, his hands still shaking. He turned to Soren, who was still standing at the railing, his heart hammering, his breath coming in short gasps, his hands gripping the wood so tightly his knuckles were white. Torben's face softened, actually softened, the hard lines melting into something almost gentle, almost tender. "Are you hurt?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "No," Soren managed, though his arm ached where Eric had grabbed him. "I am not hurt." Torben reached out and took Soren's hand, pulling him away from the railing, away from the edge, away from the cold white fog that wanted to swallow him. "Come," he said, "stay close to me. From now on, you stay close to me. Do you understand?" Soren nodded, unable to speak. Torben led him back to the stern quarters, and when the door closed behind them, Soren leaned against the wall and let out a breath he did not know he had been holding. His legs were shaking, his hands were shaking, everything was shaking. "You called me yours," Soren said, his voice barely audible. "In front of everyone. You said, 'Touch him again,' and you answered to me. You claimed me. Publicly." "Yes," Torben said. He stepped closer, close enough that Soren could feel the heat radiating from his body, close enough that Soren could see the rapid pulse beating in his throat. "Because it is true. You are mine, Soren. I do not know when it happened. I do not know how. I do not know if it was the broth, or the stars, or the way you saved Leif without thinking. But you are mine. And I am yours. That is the truth of it. That is the only truth that matters anymore." Soren reached up with a trembling hand and touched Torben's face, the sharp jaw, the thin scar, the lips that had spoken so few kind words in his life but had somehow spoken the ones that mattered most. "Kiss me," Soren whispered. "Please, I have been waiting. I've been waiting for days, for weeks, for my whole life maybe. Kiss me, Torben." Torben kissed him. It was not gentle. It was not tentative. It was desperate, hungry, the kiss of a man who had been starving for something he did not know how to name, who had finally found it and would not let it go. His hands cupped Soren's face, rough and warm, and Soren's fingers tangled in Torben's dark hair, pulling him closer, closer, as if they could fuse into one person if they just held on tight enough. When they finally broke apart, both of them were shaking. Both of them were breathing hard. Both of them were crying, silent tears streaming down their faces, mixing together where their cheeks touched. "Stay alive," Torben said, his forehead pressed to Soren's, his voice raw and broken. "Stay close. That is the only rule that matters now, the only rule I will ever ask you to follow." "I have been staying," Soren said, and he was laughing and crying at the same time, giddy with relief and fear and joy. "I will always stay. I will stay alive. I will stay close. I will stay with you. Forever, if you will have me." Torben kissed him again, softer this time, and it felt like a vow. The great storm came on the 29th day. It rose out of the south like a living thing, black and screaming, with waves taller than the mast, and wind that tore the breath from your lungs and rain that fell so hard it felt like stones. Torben had seen storms before. He had been sailing since he was old enough to hold an oar, had survived shipwrecks and hurricanes and the frozen wrath of the northern seas, but nothing like this. This was the kind of storm that broke ships and swallowed crews, that left no survivors to tell the tale, that made the bravest warriors weep and pray to gods they had long stopped believing in. Jarl Hakon, old and frail, was struck by a falling spar within the first hour. The heavy wooden beam caught him across the shoulders and sent him crashing to the deck, blood streaming from a gash on his forehead, his eyes unfocused and glassy. Torben had to make a choice: steer the ship through the maelstrom, tend to his dying father, or protect Soren. He tried to do all three, but the storm would not let him. The wind howled, the waves crashed, the ship groaned like a wounded animal, and then a wave, a mountain of black water, broke over the deck. When it receded, Soren was gone. Torben screamed his name, but the wind swallowed the sound. He searched the chaos, the darkness, the churning water, his eyes burning with salt and terror. And then he saw him, a pale shape in the darkness clinging to a rope that trailed over the side, his body half submerged, his fingers slipping one by one. Torben did not think. He tied a line around his own waist, handed the other end to the nearest sailor. It was Leif, the boy Soren had saved, and shouted, "Do not let go of this rope. Do you understand? Do not let go, no matter what." Then he jumped. The water was colder than anything he had ever felt, cold enough to stop his heart, cold enough to freeze his blood in his veins. The shock of it stole his breath, and for a terrible moment he could not move, could not think, could not do anything except sink. But then he thought of Soren, Soren's smile, Soren's voice, Soren's hands holding his in the starlight, and he fought. He swam toward the pale shape in the darkness, fought the current, fought the waves, fought the cold that was trying to pull him under. He reached Soren just as his fingers slipped from the rope. Torben grabbed him around the waist and held on. "I have you," Torben shouted, though he knew Soren could not hear him over the roar of the storm. "I have you. Do not let go of me. Do not let go, Soren. Do not you dare let go." Soren's arms wrapped around his neck, weak but determined, and Torben pulled them both toward the rope, toward the ship, toward survival. The rope was still there. Leif had held on. The brave boy, the boy Soren had saved. The sailors hauled them aboard, hands grabbing Torben's arms, Soren's clothes, pulling them over the railing and onto the deck. They collapsed in a heap, gasping, bleeding, shivering uncontrollably. Torben's hands were so cold he could not feel them, but he could feel Soren, warm, alive, pressed against his chest. "You jumped," Soren said, his teeth chattering so hard he could barely form the words. "You could have died. You should have stayed on the ship. You should have." "Rule," Torben said, cutting him off. He pulled Soren closer, wrapped his arms around him, pressed his lips to Soren's frozen hair. "Stay alive. Stay close. I cannot break it. I will not break it. Not for anything. Not even for the storm." He held Soren as the storm raged around them, as the ship creaked and groaned, as the waves crashed and the wind screamed. He held him, and he did not let go. The storm passed. The ship did not sink. Jarl Hakon recovered, his wounds shallow despite the blood, and on the 35th day they sighted land, a green shore, a sandy beach, a river that led inland to places no Viking had ever explored. But Torben did not care about the land. He cared about the man sitting beside him at the bow of the ship, his dark hair drying in the sun, his hand resting on Torben's knee. "We made it," Soren said, his voice full of wonder. "We made it together. We survived the storm. We survived the voyage. We survived each other." "We made it because of you," Torben said, turning to face him. His gray eyes were soft now, softer than Soren had ever seen them, soft with love and relief and the quiet joy of having survived. "You kept us on course with your maps. You saved life from the wave. You saved me from the sea. You are the reason we are alive, Soren. Not me. Not my crew. You." Soren shook his head, but he was smiling. "We are the reason we are alive," he said. "Together. That is the rule, remember. Stay alive. Stay close. Stay together." Torben pulled him into his arms and held him as the ship sailed into the harbor, as the crew cheered and the gulls cried and the sun broke through the clouds. He held him, and he did not let go. He would never let go again. Jarl Hakon stood on the beach, leaning on a walking stick, watching the crew unload the ship. His eyes found Torben and Soren standing close, their hands intertwined, and something in his weathered face softened. He had seen the way his son looked at the southerner. He had seen the way the Southerner looked back, and he understood. "You love him," Hakon said when Torben approached. It was not a question. "Yes," Torben said, and he did not hesitate. "I do. I love him more than I have ever loved anything. More than the sea. More than the ship. More than my own life." Hakon was silent for a long moment. The waves crashed behind him. The gulls cried overhead. Then he nodded. "I did not understand at first. I thought love was weakness. I thought it made you soft, made you careless, made you vulnerable to your enemies. But I have watched you these past weeks, Torben. You are not weaker. You are stronger. You are braver. You are more of a leader than I ever was." He reached out and clasped his son's shoulder, his old hand trembling slightly. "Keep him. Protect him. And let him protect you. That is not weakness. That is the only way to survive a world as cruel as this one. Love is not the enemy, Torben. Fear is the enemy. And you have conquered your fear." Torben's throat tightened. He looked back at Soren, who was helping some of the younger sailors carry supplies ashore, his bad leg slowing him but not stopping him. Soren looked up and caught Torben's eye, and he smiled. A real smile, warm and bright. The smile that had cracked the ice around Torben's heart. "I will, father," Torben said. "I will keep him. I will protect him. And I will love him every day for the rest of my life." They built a settlement on that shore, not a raiding camp, not a temporary shelter, but a home. They built houses of stone and wood, a longhouse for gatherings, a dock for the ships that would come after them. Torben was named Jarl after his father's death the following spring, and Soren stood beside him at the ceremony, not as a prisoner, not as a slave, not as a concubine, but as his equal. The crew who had once mocked Soren now respected him. The sailors who had once wanted to throw him overboard now sought his counsel. And Eric the brute, well, Eric had been left behind on the old shore, with nothing but a warning and a scar to remember them by. At night, when the work was done and the fires burned low and the settlement slept, Torben and Soren would walk down to the beach and watch the waves roll in, the same waves that had tried to destroy them, that had failed, that had delivered them to each other. "Do you ever regret it?" Torben asked one evening, his arm around Soren's shoulders, the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose. Being taken, being brought on that ship, almost drowning, almost freezing, almost losing everything. Soren leaned into him, his head resting on Torben's chest, his ear over Torben's heart. He could feel it beating, steady, strong, alive. "No," he said, "because if none of that had happened, I would never have met you. And you are worth every wave, every storm, every moment of fear. You are worth the vomiting and the cold and Eric's fists. You are worth it all, Torben, every bit of it." Torben kissed the top of his head, breathing in the scent of his hair. Sea salt and wood smoke and something sweeter, something that was just Soren. "I love you," he said. "I love you, Soren. I did not know how to say it before. I did not know I was allowed, but I love you. I love your stubbornness and your kindness and your stupid maps that saved our lives. I love your bad leg and your soft hands and the way you never give up, no matter how hard the world tries to break you." Soren tilted his face up, his eyes bright with tears and starlight. "I love you too, Torben. I love your silence and your strength and the way you held my hand in the darkness. I love that you jumped into the sea for me. I love that you broke every rule for me. And I will stay alive, stay close, stay with you, always, forever, until the sea swallows the land and the stars fall from the sky." The waves crashed against the shore, the stars wheeled overhead, and two men who had been strangers on a longship held each other in the darkness. They had been changed by the voyage, both of them, forever. The voyage had taken everything from them, their homes, their families, their old lives, but it had also given them each other. And that, they both knew, was more than enough. That was everything.